I would like to thank Gordon Simmons for his help in preparing my speech.
No problem.
I must tell you, I only started learning English a few years ago as a self-taught watching TV. So, please be indulgent with my pronunciation, Italian pronunciation. I begin by introducing you to the journey. For this reason, I have to read what I want to say to you. I begin by introducing you to the journey we will take together. I will start by explaining why psychosynthesis is more relevant today than ever. Then I will talk a little about Roberto Assagioli, and I will try to answer the question if and how it is possible to define psychosynthesis. This is to clarify some fundamental aspects of our approach, and I will conclude with the central and original core of the psychosynthetic teaching. First of all, let's see why psychosynthesis is a precious gift, especially today. As all been said before, we are living in an era of transition characterized by the profound changes that the unstoppable process of globalization brings with it. Perhaps the labor of giving birth to a consciousness with a planetary extension. We are facing not only several hot issues, many of which are absolutely not new, like socio-economic and gender inequalities, wars, mass migration, intense climate changes, and so on. But above all, we are facing the new global scope of these issues. It is this global impact, I believe, that is the substantial difference from the past. Obviously, this state of affairs also has a profound effect on individuals. It reshapes our old needs and constellates new ones. Psychology, and with it the other scientific disciplines, has the ethical task of confronting and questioning itself deeply on the state of affairs in order to offer vision and articulated, meditated answer. I have to talk a bit louder. It is no longer just a question of the good and health of individuals, but of the good and health of the entire human group, and of all the living beings who inhabit this planet. And it is here that psychosynthesis reveals today, perhaps even more than in the past, its extreme topicality, its being a precious gift. Why? Because what most characterizes it is its systemic, complex, and synthetic vision inspired by the guiding principle of all psychosynthesis, the general principle of organization, integration, and synthesis. It is an integral vision of the human being considered in all its aspects and above all in the relations between these different aspects. But who was Roberto Assagioli, the founder of psychosynthesis? Some might say one of the very first Italian psychoanalysts. Others might say a passionate scholar and a practitioner of meditation. Assagioli was a pragmatist, but also an astrologer, a pioneer of humanistic psychology, but also a mystic, a precursor of psychosomatic medicine, an adventure lover, a psychiatrist, an esotericist, a scientist, an orientalist, an educator, a spiritual guide. But who was Roberto Assagioli really? And let's proceed with a fundamental operation in psychosynthesis we did before, and distinguish the different roles, the different interests, the various phases of Assagioli from its most intimate and authentic essence. Then we can say that in the end, Roberto Assagioli was simply himself, a unique and original being, just like each of us. When I was writing my second book and thinking about how to tell its story, I let myself be guided by the symbolic image of the development of a tree, and I therefore divided it into 4 parts: sowing, sprouting, pruning, and blossoming. Let's start from the first part. Roberto Marco Grego was born in Venice to Jewish parents. At the age of 2, he suddenly lost his father, and after some time, his mother remarried with the doctor Emanuele Assagioli. In 1904, the family moved to Florence to allow him to attend in the Faculty of Medicine. The university years are characterized by already vast and diversified cultural interests, and 3 in particular, the lines of research that Assagioli will then deepen throughout his life. American psychology, in particular the pragmatism of William James, psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, and the fundamental the spiritual traditions of many cultures, especially the Oriental ones. Assagioli attended the Florentine avant-garde movement. Here you see the young Assagioli, by collaborating with Papini and Prezzolini in the editorial staff of the magazines. He wrote of that experience: the literary avant-garde had the great merit of introducing into the Italian culture some of the at the time somewhat provincial, the thoughts of some of the most important philosophers and psychologists of the time: Nietzsche, Freud, Bergson, and especially the American pragmatism of William James and Emerson. The avant-garde openly criticized the materialistic approach of the science of the time, and they said, this science, mechanical and rationalist, certainly serves many very useful purposes, but has very little to tell us about the ultimate and existential problems of the human being. At the same time, Assagioli traveled all over Europe to study with the major psychiatrists of the time: Flournoy, Claparède, Krapperin, Bleuler, and Carl Gustav Jung. Thus, he came to know of the theory developed by Freud, and although very, very young, he fully understood their revolutionary significance. A great merit if we think how psychoanalysis was then opposed in Italy. Assagioli will in fact be, and it was only 20 years old, the first Italian to translate some of Freud's articles, the first Italian admitted to the International Psychoanalytic Society, and the first student to graduate himself with a thesis on the subject, written right under the supervision of Carl Gustav Jung, with whom he will then maintain friendly relations throughout his life. However, right from the start, and thus anticipating by decades many of the topics highlighted then by humanistic and transpersonal psychology, Assagioli identifies the limits and weak points of psychoanalysis. He believes that in the psychic building, there are not only the unhealthy subsoil to be restored, those so well underlined by Freud, but also the various floors, and finally the luminous attics with large terraces, where you can receive the life-giving rays of the sun and in the evening contemplate the stars, he wrote. And in fact, the birth of his great interest in the spiritual, philosophical, and esoteric traditions of many cultures date back to this very period. He takes Sanskrit lessons to read the classic of Eastern spirituality, which show him without a shadow of a doubt how much the introspective psychology of the East, especially regarding the higher states of consciousness, it has reached such a point of complexity and depth that it far exceeded contemporary psychology. The second part of his life, which I have called sprouting, the numerous stimuli accumulated previously begin to take shape. He married Nella Ciapetti, and a year later, their only son, Ilario, was born. In the same period, they moved from Florence to Rome, where Assagioli began to carry out the activity of psychiatrist and founded the Istituto. 1977 is an important date because psychosynthesis is officially born. Assagioli publishes in English the booklet A New Method of Healing, Psychosynthesis, in which he outlines some significant points of the psychosynthetic model: the body-psyche interaction, the need to systematically integrate various approaches and methods. The goal is no longer simply the elimination of symptoms, but the formation or reconstruction of the entire personality. For Assagioli, it was certainly very important to ask how and why do we get sick? But it was equally important, and perhaps even more, to ask how and why are we healthy? How and why do we grow, mature, and realize ourselves more fully? For these reasons, psychosynthesis does not find its application only in the treatment of psychic and psychosomatic disorder, but it is also a method for education, for children and adult education, for self-development, for the harmonization of interpersonal relationships and social relationships. The importance of these different fields of application lies in confirming the pragmatic nature and versatility of the psychosynthetic methods. That's why there are also very different professional figures who are trained in psychosynthesis: doctors, psychotherapists, counselors, but also managers, coaches, teachers, social workers, and so on. Pruning is the title of the third part of his life, since this is certainly a very difficult and troubled period. Assagioli was Jewish, and during the fascism he suffers racial persecution. He was forced to close the institute. He was even denounced, arrested, and imprisoned on charges of being a pacifist and an internationalist. And after this, he was forced to hide in the mountain with his son Ilario to escape the Nazis. Recently, the Istituto in Florence published the book Freedom in Jail, which collects the memory of this experience, about this experience. At the end of the war, Assagioli resumed his activity. Unfortunately, his only son Ilario died of pulmonary tuberculosis at the age of 27 years old, also due to the hardship suffered during the war. But despite all these difficult trials, Assagioli continued to spread and develop psychosynthesis. And in fact, the last period of his life, which I have called blossoming, saw the birth of numerous centers scattered all over the world, and the first official acknowledgement of his work. He's invited to present speeches in the international congresses of psychotherapy. He's one of the founders of the Italian Society of Psychosomatic Medicine and invited to present a main lecture in the plenary session of the first International Psychosomatic Week in history. He's part of the editorial board of the Journal of Humanistic Psychology and of the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology. And this is also the time for publications. Three, the most important ones, that mark the symbolic fulfillment of the lines of research that he had cultivated since his youth. He publishes, first in English, the book in which his studies on psychoanalysis and psychotherapy finds their systematic organization. The interest for American pragmatism and for the fundamental theme of will will give life to his second book, considered by many one of the very first coaching manual. In the last day of his life, he was working on a book dedicated to psychology of the I and the self. In this text converge the reflection of an entire life on the different paths that human beings travel in search of their self-realization and self-transcendence. And finally, this will also be the period in which Assagioli began to train students from many parts of the world, those who will continue its work to the present day. And to conclude the presentation of Roberto Assagioli, one of the students tell in an interview an episode with which I like to close. This student said that Assagioli had a little boat on his desk, and when the housekeeper dusted, it got torn around. He always put the boat back in the direction of the window toward the open space. And once the student asked him why, and he replied, "Because it represents adventure for me. I can start again at any time, change and call everything into question." Over the years, he repeated that he had not yet learned to live, that we never stop learning to live. Let's now go back to psychosynthesis and see if and how we can define it. All those who face this task agree on one point. It is not an easy thing. Why? To answer this question, let's start with the very first words of a quote of Assagioli himself, who stated, "We can first indicate and not define, because all definitions are limited and limiting psychosynthesis as," and I like to dwell for a moment on that distinction between define and indicate, because it allows us to understand a fundamental aspect of the psychosynthetic approach. We can define objects which are inert or dead. Subjects, instead, which are alive, can only be indicated, never fully grasped once and for all. And in fact, we must consider psychosynthesis as a subject in progress, an open, living and vital system which develops by constantly interacting with the environment that surrounds it. Starting from 1927, Assagioli then indicates psychosynthesis in various more or less broad ways that I have organized, starting from the more general and inclusive ones to conclude with the more specific and technical ones. He said, we can first indicate psychosynthesis above all as a movement, a tendency, a goal that translates into an attitude and a slow conquest towards organization, integration, and synthesis in every field. First of all, in the vast field of human knowledge, to foster the integration of psychology with other sciences and with philosophy, religion, and art. This is the first important characteristic that indicates psychosynthesis, the interdisciplinarity, the constant dialogue between different points of view that allow us to overcome the fragmentation of knowledge. The interdisciplinary approach is today more relevant than ever. The theory of complexity speaks about a new alliance between science and philosophy. Quantum physics dialogues with the most ancient spiritual traditions, psychology and psychotherapy with neuroscience. Biology seems to demonstrate the presence of free will even in the invertebrates. Very important subject. But when Assagioli talks about integrating psychology with the other sciences, what kind of psychology is he talking about? He speaks of a psychology which in turn is a synthesis of all the positive and constructive elements existing in every school or psychological movement, with the aim of integrating American psychology with European psychology and Eastern psychology. Today we could update this indication by adding the knowledge that comes from the other two continents, the ethnopsychiatric approaches, the indigenous psychology, the different shamanic psychologies. So after interdisciplinarity, the second important characteristic that indicates psychosynthesis is interculturality, internationality, also a very topical one in this time of crisis. Assagioli's intentions was probably to create a breathing planetary psychology. Having explored what attitude psychosynthesis adopts in its relation with the landscape that surrounds it, let's now see what vision proposes regarding the internal relation which characterizes each individual. Psychosynthesis is therefore also a bio-psycho-socio-spiritual conception of the human being, hence the most complete definition of biopsychosynthesis. And psychosynthesis is also a dynamic and dramatic conception of human life as a struggle between a multiplicity of rebellious and contradictory forces, called parts or sub-personality, the actors, and the unifying center, the I, self, which tends to compose them in harmony, to use them in the most useful and creative ways. And this is the action of will. And finally, psychosynthesis is also a set of techniques and methods of psychological action aimed at promoting the integration and harmonious development of the human personality. But although psychosynthesis incorporates the contribution of various approaches, it is very, very important to keep in mind that the central core that forms its essence is original. Otherwise, there is the risk of presenting a distorted and diluted vision. We are not making a fruit salad. Psychosynthesis is a systemic, complex, and synthetic vision of human being, mainly represented by the two fundamental diagrams, the egg diagram and the star of psychological function, and in the 7 fundamental experiences that constitute the sine qua non of its training. And you will probably have the opportunity to deepen the 2 diagrams later during the workshops. Let's see briefly what these fundamental experiences consist of. 5 minutes and I'm... The first experience, this identification, we did the exercise before, is about creating more space between us and our different ways of being, the different roles or parts we play in life, the sub-personality. It is a process of liberation that gradually leads us to the second experience, the discovery, the unveiling of who we really are, of our center, our I, or personal self. And the more we free ourselves from old or inappropriated masks, the more we have the possibility of breathing, of moving. And this authentic movement of our being is what we call will. This is an important point. We are not just aware and passive observer. We are living beings, vital, and therefore our true nature is also to move, to flourish, to express ourselves, engaging, creating, loving, working, serving, and in this way, becoming more and more what we may be, realizing our ideal model, the full expression of our unique potential. This is the 4th experience. The 5th is synthesis, a very important one, of course. I have pointed out throughout my speech that the process of integration, organization, and synthesis is the guiding principle of all psychosynthesis. And it is also the process that leads us safely, meaning without psychological split, without fanaticism and exaltation, to the last two experiences. The superconscious is the noetic transpersonal dimension of the personality. All the highest potentiality reside in it. Not only the spiritual or religious experiences, but also the impulses to heroic and ethical action, the aesthetic experiences and artistic creations, the great scientific intuitions, the highest sentiments and values. Finally, the self. The self is the most extensive and mature center of synthesis of all our individuality, the instance that can contain our totality and completeness. It is actually very difficult to speak about the self. Remember, language can only define objects, and it is insufficient to explain the subject we are, the self. Other forms of expression, art, music, poetry, are better able to indicate what the self is. I wish to conclude by recalling that at the heart of psychosynthesis there are two fundamental questions. Who are we really? And what do we really want? Which doesn't seem very different from asking what do we really love? What's moving us? Concretely, the journey we undertake in search of our answers has the ultimate aim to lead us to the fuller and deeper realization of our true identity of the self, to broaden our understanding of the substantial interrelation of all things within ourselves, with all our different parts and aspects, and outside ourselves, in ever wider circles with our family, friends, colleagues, with the groups to which we belong, and gradually with the whole of humanity, with all other living beings, nature, and the planet that is our home. In my opinion, fostering this experience has never been more urgent and significant than in this particular historical period. The shift of attention from the past to the relations between the parts clarify and expands our vision of the common good and our ability to act accordingly. Psychosynthesis leads us to action which is therefore an expression of this ever deeper awareness of interbeing. We could say action guided by love. That's why psychosynthesis is a precious gift, especially today. That's why his time has come. I'm finished.